All right, if everybody could make their way back to their seats, please. We're going to get started so that we can get out on time. Well, one of the things I know that our team at Akron Community Foundation loves to do when we have events is we end it on time. So I'm going to be watching Kate and Emily. I'm going to be on you to make sure we get out, because who doesn't really like to get out of an event early, as a matter of fact. So that's what we're going to try to do, is keep us on time. But before we start with our next session, I wanted to thank Pam Hickson-Stevenson, who is out here, is out there somewhere. There she is, who is the director of the Akron-Summit County Public Library system, and is our gracious host for today. She and all of her staff have been fantastic to work with, and we greatly appreciate being able to utilize this space. But I also wanted to tell you some of the resources that are here at this main library, and I'm not sure how many of you are taking advantage of it, or if maybe you've not heard about it, but up on the third floor there is the Nonprofit Resource Center, where there is a tremendous amount of literature, books, information, grant research, grant writing pieces, board training books, tremendous amount of information and materials up there. So if you've never been up there, I would encourage you to go take a visit up there. Also, here at the main branch, there's the Micro Business Center, which really works with new or those who want to establish a new nonprofit organization. So though it's called the Micro Business Center, they do also do a lot of work with the nonprofit sector as well, looking at business concepts and plans as well. And then finally is the Tech Zone, which includes the makerspace, where you can create banners, you can do engravings. Organizations have made campaign buttons for levies and those types of things. That is all available to nonprofit organizations. And all you have to pay is the cost of the materials. So all of those pieces are there that you can create banners for your organization. You're just paying for the raw material, and that's here at the library. So they have staff on hand to give you some help or to answer some questions. And again, Pam, thank you for this wonderful resource that we have here at our library. So we just learned about strategic planning and the importance of it. Now you're all here to learn about how to get money from it, right? So what we're going to hear is a little bit more of the best practice, because really when we're talking about strategic planning, there are some key fundamental pieces. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that, and then how do we utilize this as a fundraising strategy. So from Ali Sterling Philanthropy, which is based out of Toledo, Ohio, does work throughout the country with nonprofit organizations as well as community foundations. Today with us we have Kate Smith, who is the vice president. Kate is an experienced strategist and detail-oriented manager with a diverse background in strategic fundraising, nonprofit capacity building, and board governance. Before joining Ali Sterling Philanthropy as a vice president, Kate served as the chief business development officer in Ohio for the law firm Shoemaker, Loop & Kendrick. Prior to that, she was senior advisor at Ali Sterling, served as the associate director of the Center for Nonprofit Resources, and a special events manager for Make-A-Wish Foundation in Toledo, Ohio. Kate holds a certificate in fundraising management and a certificate in nonprofit executive leadership from the fundraising school at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, which is also a great resource online. Kate earned her bachelor's and master's degrees from Bowling Green State University. Also with us today we have Emily Croak. Emily is an experienced facilitator and organizational leadership coach with a passion for helping nonprofits build strong relationships and stakeholder engagement that lead to successful missions. Before coming to Ali Sterling Philanthropy, Emily worked in human resources for one of the nation's largest providers of skilled nurses service, where understanding the psychological side of business, how to marry employees' interests with best practices and leadership skills to further an organization's mission. Emily is a graduate of the University of Toledo and serves on the board of the Ballet Theater of Toledo. She also teaches ballet and volunteers as a running buddy for Girls on the Run. So without any further ado, we welcome Emily and Kate to the stage.
Hi, everyone. I promise we will let you out on time for lunch, now that I know that the stakes are very high for that, and it's important around here. Thank you for having us here today. Thank you to Brian and the Community Foundation. It's always nice to get out of Toledo for a day and visit our neighbors, and especially when we're driving right into the beautiful sunrise. So we're really excited about our presentation today, especially after the wonderful presentation from Brian and Julie that we just heard. And we like this because it's great for both new organizations who are kind of in their first foray into the strategic planning world, because as we know, it can be a bit overwhelming. But it's also wonderful for mature organizations who either want to re-energize their strategic planning process or who just want to increase their fundraising results, which don't we all? I'm pretty sure we're all on the same page for that. So today we'll talk a lot about how to use your strategic plan as a basis for your fundraising and organizational excellence in fundraising. We'll talk about philanthropy trends, some principles of fundraising, before we get into the real fundraising and strategic plan component and kind of pull out the metrics and goals and how to include your board chair, your volunteers, and all the stakeholders in between in that process. So as we talked about, we are going to just build on the last presentation we heard from the strategic plan. They covered it beautifully. And now we're just going to focus on isolating that fundraising piece. We'll also talk about the stakeholder component, so how to include and involve all of your stakeholders in your strategic plan, and then how to leverage that for fundraising success. Just a little bit about our firm today. As Brian said, we are with Allie Sterling Philanthropy. The firm was founded about 11 years ago. We are located in Toledo, Ohio. We work primarily in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, but also have a strong presence across the country. We work with clients from Los Angeles all the way to Maine, so we are all over. We are a member of the Giving Institute and also a founding member of the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, Philanthropy Information Exchange. Okay, say that 10 times fast. And what we do is we are a partnership-driven consulting firm. So we are all of our clients we establish partnerships with. We look at ourselves as a true extension of their team. And we work in the three areas primarily of fundraising solutions. So that includes feasibility studies, capital campaigns, and overall assessments of an organization's fundraising program. Strategic planning, like we've talked about, and what we do for that is we look at three components of act, assess, and align for strategic planning. And then we also have a board catalyst series. We do a lot of board leadership trainings, board governance. So we those are our three main components. Just to give you a brief overview of the types of organizations that we work with an extremely broad and diverse group of clients, which is what we love. Since we are their partners, it gives us the wonderful best practices that we've mentioned and that we've talked about that we can share with our clients. We work with technically and typically the well-positioned nonprofit. And when we say well-positioned, what we really mean is organizations that have staff and board members that are committed to fundraising and to a fundraising plan and program. Those that are adaptable and willing to innovate and are open to new ideas. And then those that have a strategic plan, or at least are understanding of the fact that they need a strategic plan in the near future. And then just a quick look at our agenda today. So we are not going to be spending a ton of time on trends in philanthropy because we could spend 6 hours on that on its own. So what we've done is included a handout that is in your folders, it should be towards the back, with some data and trends from Giving USA. If we have time at the end, we'll circle back, but I don't anticipate that. I assume there will be lots of questions. So if we can, we'll touch on it. If not, please feel free to review and either reach out and contact us with any questions or thoughts, and we'll go from there. So right now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kate Smith, who's going to take it from here.
Thanks. All right. How's everybody doing today? Good. Thank you again to Brian and Julie. As Emily and I were sitting here this morning, You know, it's always hard to follow another consulting firm when you're not familiar with them, we haven't met yet, which we're super excited to do. But what is really reassuring is when you hear someone talking your same language. So again, hearing things that we would typically say, which is really refreshing for Emily and I to kind of come up here and follow. And you guys did such a great job of covering the overall strategic planning process, what goes into it, why it's important, and how you can move through and track and measure that. What we'll do today is we're going to kind of take one component of what should be in your strategic plan, which is hopefully a fundraising component, and we'll really break that down, talk about why that's important and how you can operationalize it and involve your board, your volunteers, and really hopefully see some results from that. So let me get a little bit situated here. And I'd love to just start with this quote. So fundraising is a systematic, coordinated effort inviting people to experience the joy of giving. So what I love to start with here is just a reiteration that fundraising is not begging. It's not arm twisting. It's not hitting someone up for something. Really, I think as an industry, when we hear people talk about fundraising in sort of this negative way, we really do ourselves a disservice. Words are so important. How we use words, how we talk about our work, how we talk about what we do. Words are really what ultimately are going to make the difference in someone saying yes to our organization. So, for example, when you think about fundraising and you hear me say charity or charitable donation, kind of think about how that sounds. And then if you hear me say, I'd like to make a charitable investment in your organization, do those two things feel a little bit different to you? Do you think maybe about when you hear investment, you might think a little bit more engagement, a little bit more commitment to the impact that might come out? Or you might even think, what's the return, right? The return on my investment, what am I getting back? And so in theory, you're creating, just by a shift in words, you're creating a different partnership with the person making that investment in your organization. We talk about giving being joyful. And this is where we can kind of start to lay the groundwork for that joy by how we talk about this and how we use our words. So I'm going to challenge all of you, as we sit here and we talk through strategic planning and fundraising today, to think about how you can look at fundraising through a more joyful lens, okay? So I'm guessing we have a wide range of organizations here in the room. For those of you that might think you have sort of a new to fundraising, would you just raise your hand? Okay, and those of you who have sophisticated, you've been doing it a while, well-seasoned? Okay, good. So for some of you, this is going to be a little bit of a review. It's going to be a refresher, and so I apologize for that, but when we've got a mixed crowd, sometimes it's nice to just do a little bit of a dive into some key principles. And so we'll start with a few key things so that we can talk later on about how to be purposeful and how to really be strategic in our efforts with fundraising. So 5 key steps for fundraising success. And again, this is bare bones, super basic in terms of thinking about how we as organizations can position ourselves strongly for fundraising. The very first thing, package and sell your mission. So what do we mean by packaging and selling our mission, right? We all have different goals that we're trying to achieve as nonprofit organizations. But what we want to try to avoid is that sort of black hole fundraising, right? Just give to us, support our organization. We know that donors and those that are making investments in our organization, they want to know what they're supporting specifically. So when we say package and sell your mission, we want to know, what does my $25 support? What does my $100 support? What does my $100,000 support? Be specific about what your needs are, why it's important that you need that support, and then be able to communicate that. One way that you can do that as a smaller organization or even as a larger is to provide micro-giving options. So you're literally saying $25 will purchase breakfast, or $100 a day will provide childcare for 3 children, whatever it might be. Being able to really break that down and be specific is really helpful when you're trying to talk about your mission with those that might be investing. Always providing donor-centered choices. And so this circles back to, how many of you have heard of Penelope Burke? Okay, good, some hands raised. If you haven't heard of Penelope Burke, we would really recommend checking out her books, Donor-Centered Fundraising. What she's done over the past, a million years, it seems like at this point, she's been surveying donors and organizations and really finding out what are some of those key motivations. She puts data behind what we tend to think about as an art and science of fundraising. It helps us as practitioners and users of her work be able to kind of justify what makes sense about what we do and how we do it. So again, Donor-Centered Fundraising, Penelope Burke, very, very good resource. But she'll talk often about what motivates donors and the fact that our fundraising, if we put our donors in the center of what we're doing, we're more likely to see results. So what does that mean? It means that we might be communicating, hopefully, beyond just that thank you for your investment or your donation. So when someone makes a gift, we send that thank you letter. What happens between that thank you and the next time we might be asking for a gift, right? So hopefully we're communicating with them about what's happening, the impact of our gifts, the impact of our investments, what we're doing as an organization, what our overall strategic plan is, how we're operationalizing that and reaching our goals over the course of a year. Really involving them and giving them opportunities to volunteer with our organization, really helping them fit in and kind of fold into our overall mission. And then creating virtual marketplaces. This is another way that we can really package and sell our mission, right? People are giving in many different ways. It's not always just that handwritten check that's being delivered at your office or sent to you in the mail. It's your website. It's different vehicles through social media. There's a million different ways, but ideally we need to make sure that as organizations, in each of those ways, we're communicating what the need is very articulately and that we're thanking them meaningfully regardless of how they choose to give. And then lastly, another part of the package should be including that peer-to-peer testimony. So encouraging and highlighting those that are giving to your organization to share why they're giving. Their influence will help lend credibility to the gifts that you're asking for and encourage and influence others to give as well. And not also just those that are investing, but those that you serve. Tell their stories and share their stories about the impact that you're making in their lives as part of your overall mission. Okay, so build and inspire a culture of philanthropy. How many of you talk about culture of philanthropy within your organization? Some of you? Good. So when we think about culture of philanthropy, what this means is that fundraising and philanthropy is really elevated to a level of importance within our organization. That means that everyone within the organization understands and knows why we need support at the most basic level. A great example of this, we had a client that we were working with in the healthcare industry. And we are working usually with just the development team. And in a big healthcare system, as you can imagine, it is challenging to be able to, across the board, make sure everyone from frontline staff to those volunteers working the front desk, to our doctors, to our technicians, to our nurses, that everyone understands what exactly we might be raising money for at any given point in time. So a nurse is working with a family who had someone, going through some healthcare challenges and issues. And when they came out the other side, they said to the nurse, we are so grateful for the service that we received from you and from your team and from the facility. How can we give back? And the nurse says, well, our team, we love a pizza party, which is also really fantastic, and they definitely deserve way more than a pizza party. But what would also be helpful is the nurse said, she said, I'd love to introduce you to a member of our team over here, and that person is hopefully from our development team, who they can then connect about more in-depth ways for that potential person to give back, whether that be volunteering, whether that be financially, whether that maybe it's board service. There are any number of ways, but it's really incumbent upon us to help make sure that everyone within the organization knows what the options are, so that we can encourage then and hopefully reward those that are sharing the stories and encouraging those connections that might be able to happen with those that are participating within our organizations. In addition to that, everyone can articulate that case and can articulate why it's important, why we need those gifts, and that just takes a lot of training and a lot of repetition and a lot of just making sure that everyone understands and taking the time to really communicate that. Fund development is viewed and valued within the organization. So we've been talking all day about strategic planning and why that's important. We hope and we would advocate that fundraising and development work is within your strategic plan. And so elevating it to that level of importance, calling it out specifically, hopefully having that be one of your areas of focus is a way that we can stand behind our organization and say, we value this, we view this as important, and that begins to help build and inspire your culture overall. Communicate often. And so the number one way to influence more generous giving is to share with your donors and investors how their gifts were used. And so this just becomes a series of habits that we talk often about what we need, but we also talk about what we're accomplishing. as part of that. We're engaging all of our constituents. We're not making any assumptions about who can and will give to our organization, but we're giving everyone that we come into contact with, everyone that we've supported, everyone the opportunity to give at a level that's meaningful to them. And then I think it's also really important to, as part of this communicate often aspect, to make sure that we are asking for advice from those that we want support. We always have a little quip that we say with our organizations that we work with: ask for advice and you'll get money. Ask for money and you'll get advice. Now, I'm sure some of you have probably experienced this, right? And I think this also plays into, in some ways, we think, into the strategic planning process as well. Brian and Julie talked a lot about how important it is to engage your stakeholders from a survey and interview perspective when you're going through some of those strategic planning steps. This also funnels into your fundraising work. If you're engaging your stakeholders, that means your staff, your board, your volunteers, those that are giving to your organization in your strategic planning process, you're asking for their thoughts about your organization, about your goals, about where you're headed. When you circle back then to talk about gifts, hopefully you've shared with them what you've been able to come up with in terms of a strategic plan. And when you circle back to ask for investment, they already feel a part of what you're doing. They're already invested. And so it's much easier then to talk about how they can then help you achieve those goals through fundraising. Okay, so in addition to that, let's talk about, one last thing with communicate often. We also talk a lot about be everywhere and don't sit at the same table. So how often do you, as a team within your organization, go to a networking luncheon or go to an awards luncheon or something of that nature, and you all get there, and instead of scattering and seeing how many different people you can meet and talk to and connect with, you all huddle together around maybe a couple glasses of wine or some cocktails, and you stay there in that little circle most of the time. And then when it's time to go sit down, you all sit at the same table. So that happens a lot because that's our comfort zone, right? We came with these people, we're going to talk with them, we see them every day, we know them, and we're going to kind of be here in this space tonight in that way. When really we need to be looking at all of these opportunities as a way to grow our network, to be able to bring others into our mission. And so that's a really big missed opportunity. And so we always say be everywhere and don't ever sit at the same table, as easy as that might be to do. Okay, and then understand donor motivation. So this, again, I think is just really important. Don't make assumptions. How do we learn about our donors? We talk to them, we get to know them. We ask them questions, we survey them. We get to figure out how they like to give, what types of information they want to hear, how do they want to be involved, how do they want to receive their communication. We know there's not one way. The world is noisy, right? We get, at any given time, your phone is blowing up with new email, new text messages, social media. I mean, it's really, really hard to focus. And so we want to try to do our best as organizations with very limited resources and time to be able to make sure that we have a plan that tries to reach as many people as possible in the most effective way. And then lastly, upgrade your board. And I'm going to actually flip sides here when I say upgrade your board because we're going to kind of go into a whole just little brief section on this. All right, so what is the board's role in fundraising? When we say upgrade your board, this might shock you, but not every board is super comfortable with fundraising. It never happens. And even our teams and our staff aren't always super comfortable with fundraising, right? So how can we, as staff or even as volunteers expect that, I've got a board and they're going to do it all because they know it and they get it and it's their responsibility and they should. Well, they're not because we're all human, right? Well, none of us are born, I don't think, expert fundraisers. Some of us might be more inclined to do it, be able to develop the skills, but nobody really knows from the get-go what they're doing. And so it might be your first service on a board. It might be your 10th service on a board. You might still not know what your role should be or could be when it comes to fundraising. So what do you think? And again, I'm going to give you just a minute. Normally, if we had a smaller group, we'd maybe spend a little time kind of going around, but it's a little difficult with the big group today. But just if someone's comfortable, shout out, what might be one of the reasons a board's not comfortable with fundraising? They don't know how. They need to be educated on how. Okay, another reason. What was that? Rejection. Yeah, they're afraid of being told no. A lot of times our board, they might be in really successful, high-level positions. Other times they might just be, normal community people like everyone else. And so it's, no one likes to be told no. It's right. It's uncomfortable. It's not always the easiest thing. Other reasons. They haven't been asked to do it. It wasn't an expectation. I didn't know it's what I was signing up for, right? Any other ways? Any other thoughts? Not understanding the value of their networks. Very good. When you're not used to doing fundraising, you don't know how it works, you don't know how it might engage your network, there's hesitation on, I don't know if I want you talking to my friends about this, I don't know how comfortable I am. I mean, there's all sorts of barriers there. Any other thoughts? They might not be sure of specific ways to plug in. So we're going to talk about a few of those, but I want to start with one of the things that came out. They weren't sure they were expected to, or they weren't sure the how. So not understanding and knowing that it was an expectation. And this data that I'm sharing here just anecdotally comes from BoardSource, which is also a really good resource for anything board related. But they weren't sure that it was an expectation. So how do we as organizations make sure that we're setting the right expectation? I know in our first session today we were talking about having a really strong orientation program for our board members. I absolutely couldn't echo that or agree with it more. Super important. But before we even get to orientation, I think a lot of times we shoot ourselves as organizations in the feet with that very first conversation. How many of you have ever been in a situation where you've had to recruit a board member by making promises that it's not going to take that much time? Right? We're not going to ask that much of you. We hope you come to meetings, but you don't really have to. Do I have to fundraise? Well, I don't know, maybe not. Don't worry, it's going to be super easy and we just need a little bit of your time. So what are we doing as an organization, circling back to words matter, right? What are we doing as an organization in that conversation? We're doing ourselves a disservice, right? We're setting the bar really, really low, because we know we need more than that, right? We know we're worth more than that. Our missions are important, and we need leadership around the table that also thinks our missions are important. And they might not be super comfortable or not sure how they're going to plug in, but what we need to be saying is, these are our expectations. These are how many meetings. This is how often. These are how many committees we'll need you to serve on. Let's talk about your skill set, right? Let's figure out where you want to plug in. Just because you're an accountant by trade doesn't mean you want to sit on our finance committee. Maybe you're really into our programs. But it's really taking the time to meaningfully match up our board members with our opportunity and really selling it as just that, an opportunity to plug in and make a difference in our mission and in our work. And then from there, once we've shared our recruitment and we've had a really great recruitment conversation, it's a little like dating, right? That we're recruiting them, but they're also hopefully interviewing us to make sure it's a good fit. We're sharing the accurate opportunity. We're providing a really great orientation process for those board members. We need to evaluate. So we talked again about those self-assessments and the overall board assessments. Those are super important. Maybe you've had a board member that's been serving for 2 years, right? They take the time to do that self-evaluation and they realize, I'm not showing up to meetings. I'm not giving all I could. I wish I was, but my work life, my home life, something got in the way this past year. Maybe I got sick, who knows, right? But they didn't show up the way they wanted to, but they weren't sure how to have that conversation with you. An annual self-evaluation is a way for them to have a platform to begin that conversation with, hopefully, your board chair or your executive committee leader is having that conversation with them kind of one-on-one to figure out what changes could we make as a board, what changes might we be able to do to re-engage you, or is it time to open up your seat to someone else who has the ability to come in and really do what needs to happen, rather than kind of languishing in an area of it's just not working, right? So beyond that, it again circles back to and reiterates the importance of why a strategic plan is so important. From that very first conversation that you're recruiting board members and you're talking about board service, you need to be able to share, where are you going as an organization? What goals do you have, and how can a board member help plug in to help you reach those goals, right? And then we're going to talk a little bit about how, again, no one's really born an expert at fundraising. We're going to talk about a couple different ways that board members can plug in once you kind of get them rolling and you've got them oriented and they're moving in the right direction. So this diagram here, there's sort of 2 parts to this, right? The 5 I's. So this is when we're looking at how we can work as staff and board together to cultivate donors to our organization, right? So we've got the 5 I's. This is where we talk about sort of that major gift fundraising, the one-on-one development of relationships with those that we're asking to invest in our organization. It's a lot like dating, right? So it's you start with kind of figuring out who we're going to talk to, who we're going to get to know. We're going to figure out what type of information we might know, and boards and development committees and hopefully staff are working together to have these conversations to really put together a strategic way to kind of court each other to figure out, is there interest? And what tends to happen is right between interest and involvement is where we tend to get stuck as organizations. Right? We talk. We might have a few coffees. We might have a few events that we invite them to. They've shown interest, but when it really comes to getting involved within the organization by making an investment, that's where we tend to spend time waiting, instead of moving on to people that are showing that willingness to get involved and to make that investment. So this is one way that we kind of look at this process and encourage you as organizations to don't get stuck there. Move on, look for others to bring in. Keep communicating with those that you've started to develop relationships with. Don't let them go, but make sure that you're really moving on and closing things. This little diagram here on the right, the values and vision diagram, is one that we use a lot with board training. So this is a great tool that I would encourage you to copy it, steal it, use it with your boards to talk about how they can get involved. So it's not all asking, right? So when we hear fundraising, we talk about development, board members, volunteers, staff even sometimes think it's just about the ask. It's not. There's a lot that goes into it. Identification, figuring out who we're going to even talk to. Again, kind of looking back at the 5 I's, the same thing. That identification and the strategy for cultivation, those things go really hand in hand. Some of us as organizations might have more sophisticated tools at our disposal. We might have databases that we're using that we track all this information in, and we've got our lists already developed. Others of you might be new to fundraising, and you don't have a list. You don't know who you should be talking to. A DIY approach that we would suggest that's really, really simple. If you don't have a development committee, get your strongest group of volunteers that are inclined towards fundraising in a room with your executive director, and if you have development staff, great, include them too. If you don't, just the person most likely to be doing some asks and work in this area with your organization, have lunch, sit around the table, develop the list. It's that simple. Close the door. It's a private meeting. This is information typically that you kind of keep within those walls, but start to draft who might be interested. Who might be the best person to contact them? Who might be the best one to reach out to schedule that meeting? And then what might they be interested in? What types of things should we be sharing with them? So that's where you kind of get into that strategy piece. This is where board members can be really valuable. And it might not be their friends and their network, but they might be able to help you figure out who within the community, we're 2 steps away from, 3 steps away from, how we might be able to get in front of them to begin to put a strategy together for fundraising. And then there on the bottom is solicitation. That's the actual ask, right? So some board members are super comfortable there. Great, wonderful. The majority are not. I think the stat is like 10% of any board is actually comfortable there, right? So find those that aren't maybe comfortable making the ask, but they're willing to go and open the door and sit there and share their passion about why they're involved with your organization, and then take someone from your staff team who is comfortable asking. The partnership approach is a wonderful way to go about it, right? We as staff, we're in the front lines. We know what's happening. We know the data. We know the stats. We know all the things that we can share. Our board members sometimes know that, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just have a personal connection to your mission. And when they share that, coupled with your data and information, you're likely able to appeal to your potential prospect in a way that's going to meet their needs one way or the other. It's a great approach. And then lastly, recognition, stewardship, and renewal. This is saying thank you and staying connected. And this is the easiest way for board members to plug in. And I'm going to circle back to Penelope Burke, where I started. She has a great stat, and I'm going to actually circle to it so that I can give it to you exactly. So she had a stat around board thank you calls. So when an organization goes through and they've got, hopefully thresholds set up for who they want to call at what level and how that works. But the simple act of a board member who's an unpaid volunteer for your organization making a call, not to ask, but just to say thank you. Our donors that receive those calls, 95% of them are very appreciative that they received it. Well, that's great. That's good. That feels good, right? 93% would give again just because they got a call from a board member saying thank you. Now, that's the stat that's important, right? That's where we talk about that renewal and that continual connection to our organization. And 84% would likely give more than they gave the first time. So that's 95% thought it was a great idea. 93% said, yeah, I'll give again just because I got that call. That was the biggest influence. Why? And 84%, I'm going to give more next time. So this is a really easy way. Whether it's a thank you card, the calls are a really great opportunity. And yes, leave the voicemail even if you don't get them on the phone. That matters and is just as impactful as the actual phone call conversation. So again, take this diagram, share it with your board. It's a way to begin to develop that culture and to help people feel a little bit more comfortable. All right, so now that we've given sort of an overview of some basic principles, and we've talked a little bit about how to engage your board and your staff in the process, let's talk about how we can, again, from a little bit of more of a micro level than we talked about this morning, begin to operationalize the fundraising portion of your strategic plan. Okay, so we talked a lot about how to operationalize all the great tools that Brian and Julie shared with you for your overall plan. We're going to kind of focus and hone in on just the fundraising part. Okay, so how many of you that do have a strategic plan, I know you were asked to raise your hands earlier, and I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you again because I couldn't see, because I couldn't get my neck turned around all the way. How many of you have a plan now? Okay, good. About 50%, which is typically what we see. How many of you have fundraising specifically as a part of that plan? Okay, good, a good number. So that's what we're gonna talk a little bit about. We tend to find that about 50% of organizations that have a plan do not include fundraising. And one of the main reasons we hear is that, and maybe you can relate, people are really hesitant to put a number around what they say they're gonna raise because they tend to feel like that number's on their head. Right? So whether I've got $5,000 that I say I'm going to raise or whether I've got $500,000 I say I'm going to raise, as a development director or sometimes as an ED, CEO, you might feel like that number's on your head. But what we would challenge you to think about is elevating the importance of that and doing it on purpose, right? Don't just wing it and say, well, we hope we're going to raise a lot of money this year, right? When we do that, we tend to minimize the importance of it. And we tend to, it's really hard to take it seriously, right? It tends to be an afterthought versus a goal and a strategy that we are rallying around, one of our rocks, like Brian was talking about, right? Fundraising and bringing funds and resources into our organization should be one of our rocks. So, you know, when we think about sometimes our development staff tends to feel marginalized, right? We tend to feel like we might not be taken seriously within our organizations. Well, if we can't tie numbers to what we say we're going to do within the organization, it's hard to be asked to be seen any other way. So let's talk a little bit about just the overall need. And again, this reiterates, you know, we talked long and hard today about how important a plan is and why we need it. But let's talk about what organizations who have a plan are more likely to do. They're more likely to collaborate with other nonprofits. How often do you hear your funders talk about the importance of collaboration? A lot, right? There's a lot of organizations. There's limited resources. We need to figure out how to have more impact within our communities by working together. But it's kind of hard to be a great partner when you don't know as an organization where you're going, what your priorities are. Right? When you have that established, you bring more value to a partnership just by way of knowing where you're going and why. It really helps us then collaborate more efficiently with organizations. You also end up having a board who's more open to calculated risks and less likely to experience mission drift. Now, those sound like two different things in the same sentence, right? We're saying we're open to calculated risks, but we don't necessarily want to start drifting over here. Well, what we mean by that is, again, if you know where you're going and you know why you're going there and how you're planning to get there, when there is a need, something comes up that's worth looking into, you know better how to evaluate whether or not that's a good decision for your board. What we also feel like having a strategic plan does for our organizations, and whether it's, I'm going to give you a specifically development-related example here, but this can apply in many different ways. We feel like having a strategic plan in place really empowers our leadership to be able to say no when it's time to say no. Right? We've all probably experienced that really well-intentioned board member or really well-intentioned volunteer or maybe even a donor who said, you know what we should do? We should have another golf outing, right? Or we should have another race or a run, or we should do the next bright, shiny thing over here. As a development team, you're working with limited resources. Hopefully you've got an overarching strategic plan for the organization in place, and you've got a fundraising plan, right? And you've allocated all your time and resources to X number of things. And when that bright, shiny thing isn't in the plan, it's really easier for you to not make it personal, but to say, as an organization, we've adopted a strategic plan. As part of that plan, we've outlined these are our initiatives for this year. This is a great idea, and we thank you for bringing it to our attention. As, you know, as a group, as leadership, we will have to evaluate, if we're going to say yes to this, what are we going to say no to, right? Because we only have so much that we can do. And having this plan in place gives you something to put that on versus, I just don't really like golf outings. Or I just don't think we can do a golf outing. It gives you a much better way to redirect those energies and efforts. And it also says, our strategic plan is good for the next 2 years. But after that, we'll have the opportunity to reevaluate something like this, and the timing might make more sense for us as an organization. So it's also that, not yes, but not right now kind of answer too. So it really empowers us as an organization to be able to field these types of things. And then have a formal process for measuring effectiveness of organizational leadership. So Brian and Julie talked a lot about this, right? About how when you have a strategic plan in place, your goals as staff, they should change, right? Your job descriptions might change, your overall goals might change, and you'll be able to evaluate against this. And that applies to your overall plan. It also applies to your fundraising plan that's sort of within that, and being able to make sure that we are tracking our progress to goal. And then overall, they ultimately end up having more successful fundraising programs, and that's because these organizations are doing it on purpose. They're making thoughtful decisions about their strategy, about where they want to go, and how they plan to get there. So it's not enough to just have a plan. So unless your organization really, doesn't need any additional resources, again, we really encourage that fundraising be a part of it, right? So what do we do as organizations? Sometimes we talk about, we need to achieve these 3 things in our strategic plan, right? These are our pillars. These are what we've identified. We know we need resources to get there, so we bury fundraising within that and say, if we're going to expand our programming to this new community, that's going to cost money to do, right? So we put in our little resources column, money to do. We don't say how much, and we don't say how we're going to get there. What we would advocate is that one of your pillars or one of your rocks or one of your chapters, whatever you call it, one of them actually is fundraising. And then we talk about what we're going to do to be able to provide the resources for the rest of what the organization needs, whether that's ongoing programming, new programming, expanded areas, whatever that might be. And so what that looks like is a plan within a plan. So how many of you have done a strategic plan where, part of that has been, we need to develop a marketing plan, right? We hear that one a lot, right? We need to figure out how to better communicate. We don't have an annual fundraising plan. We don't have anything formal, and so that ends up being something that gets included in a plan. We might not have a volunteer recruitment plan for our organization. That needs to be developed, and all those things tend to get outlined in the larger strategic plan. Sorry, I talk with my hands. And so you end up having these sort of layers, right, of plans within plans. Your development plans ends up being one of those things that comes out of, hopefully, your strategic plan. So it's not enough, though, just to say we need to raise $100,000 extra. We need to talk about when we're going to do that, how we're going to do that, who's going to own it, and what it's going to look like. And so we also need to assign that leadership and accountability. I know Brian and Julie talked a lot about that too, right? Where does this, was it choke the neck? One throat to choke, right? So I love that, and I might be stealing that. But ultimately, when it comes to fundraising and development, we talk a lot about the need for the overall organization to own that, and we love it when a board as a whole owns those goals. And typically, we tend to recommend a development committee leads the charge on that, along with your staff, right? And so one of the tools that we end up using is a roadmap. We call it different things. It's ultimately your annual fundraising plan. Sometimes we call it a donor engagement calendar, right? It's the ways that we're going to, over the course of the year, engage our donors in our organization. Sometimes it's called a blueprint. People call it different things, but essentially it's what are we going to do over the course of the year to raise that $100,000 or whatever your number is. And so what that plan typically includes is, and I don't have an example here because ours is, it's kind of big, and I figured you wouldn't be able to see it on the screen anyway, so I'm going to talk through those elements, and should you want a copy of a sample, we're happy to send that out to you afterwards. Just grab one of us, or I've got business cards on the table out there that you can grab as well. But it typically starts with what's our internal infrastructure? How often are we talking to our board about fundraising and developing those relationships internally, right? It's not us and them, it's all of us together. How often are we meeting as a development committee? How are we communicating progress, right? So we actually track within our annual plan how often those things are happening and who's responsible for leading that. Is it our executive director? Is it our development director? Who's, from a staff perspective, engaging, and who are those audiences, right? And then we move into how are we acquiring new donors? How are we cultivating those donors? And how are we stewarding those donors? And that's where you have ultimately all of these different types of activities throughout the course of the year. Ours ends up taking a calendar format, right? So you might have special events, you might have direct mail, hopefully you've got a board campaign because secret, our giving should start with our board first before we ask anyone else to join our organization and develop and invest in that way. Staff campaigns, we always get a lot of pushback on staff campaigns, but again, for the same reason, if those closest to our organization aren't supporting us, how are we asking others to do so with a real clear, authentic heart, right? And those can look lots of different ways and get super creative, and it's not always about money. So when we talk about staff campaigns, a lot of times it's engagement and excitement. It's those types of things that circle back to that culture of philanthropy I was talking about. There might be a capital campaign on our horizon. So maybe a section of our plan includes that. Hopefully it includes major gifts and those personal one-on-one gifts as well. But it also includes our communication, right? Our social media, our marketing, all of those things. And how are we basically, over the course of a year, engaging and keeping track of our very purposeful work that all supports our fundraising efforts? Let's see here. So that ultimately ends up being our roadmap of our action steps that ultimately supports our overall larger strategic plan. I'm going to take a real quick break, see how I'm doing here on time. Oh, we're doing good. Okay.